You mentioned that I was in the United States long enough to know certain things about American strategic thinking. Actually, I was in the United States for 50 years. And since I met Henry Kissinger back in the 1970s when he joined the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, where I was a senior fellow at that time, since mid-70s. I assumed that one of key American strategic objectives was not to allow China and Russia to have better relationship among themselves than they had with the United States. And the idea that the United States would intentionally, or more likely unintentionally, pushing Russia closer to China, everyone assumed, who was looking at American foreign policy, that this is something that simply could not happen. And particularly when you are dealing with Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, very experienced people, very well-educated people, very, I should say, familiar with global affairs. When the President of the United States was, as you know very well, for many years before he became Vice President, Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, for many years occupied this important position, but also position which allows you to be educated about global affairs. What in your mind are they thinking? Why they are doing that? Is it some kind of blind momentum because of their hatred toward Russia, as many assume in Moscow? Is this some strategic plan we cannot quite understand? Or is the United States so big and powerful that we simply can do whatever without being concerned about serious negative consequences?
Dmitry, I think your last point is a very valid one. I think that figures very prominently. Remember, the presidents that you referred to before 1991 were guided largely by strategic interests. It doesn't make any difference whether you talk about George Bush, Jimmy Carter, Richard Nixon. Everyone tended to look very carefully at what the strategic interests of the United States were and what the strategic interests were of Russia, the Soviet Union, and China. We have cast that aside. It's a kind of blind arrogance informed, I'm afraid, only by ideology. The ridiculous notion that somehow or another we are the vanguard of a revolution that is sweeping the world. And this globalist revolution preaches the predominance of liberal democracy. Not that I've seen very much evidence for that lately in my own country, but they preach that, and they preach globalism as their principal ideology. In other words, that we're going to denationalize everybody, destroy borders everywhere, and we'll end up with some sort of one world government. It's all nonsense. But I think that's what's happened. Ideology has trumped interests. We've got to get back to understanding interests. And if we looked at ours, we looked at Russia's, we would understand that Russia has always had and always will a legitimate national security interest in Ukraine. And furthermore, if when you look at Russia's armed forces today, the size of these armed forces, it's absurd to suggest that Russia has any interest or plan to conquer Eastern Europe. It doesn't have the force to do it. So you can't have it both ways, Dmitry. You can't say on the one side, look at how incompetent and weak the Russians are. But, oh, by the way, if they succeed in Ukraine, they're all marching on Warsaw. It's absurd. Doesn't make any sense. We've got to get back to interests, but we need a completely new administration. Frankly, I think we need a new generation of leaders in Washington.
Well, it will not come as a surprise to you that I do not necessarily agree with everything you said, particularly about tactical nuclear weapons, but you know about them much more than I do. But I overwhelmingly agree with your basic approach to foreign affairs. But when you talk to Russians, when you talk to Chinese and to many people in Europe, they would tell you that you strategic realists in Washington, you have a lot of interesting ideas. Why should we listen to you? You don't matter much. There is bipartisan consensus in Washington that takes in the United States in a very different direction. and things are not likely to change, whoever becomes the president in 2024. Would you agree with that? Is there a credible alternative to the current American foreign policy?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that whether you are in Washington or Moscow or London or Paris or Berlin, if you are not in power, you are probably irrelevant. So from that standpoint, I can't argue with your position. I am not in a position of power or influence or authority. And until I am or others like me, we are stuck with what we've got. However, you're asking another kind of question which deserves a lot more attention, and that is, can anything really change between now and the fall of 2024? And I'll be frank with you, yes, I think it can. I think the reality that our resources are limited, the reality that we confront serious financial and economic crises at home and abroad, this will operate as a very significant constraint on our ability to meddle in the affairs of others and to use military power as we see fit.
Well, as you know, when Trump was running for presidency in 2016, at first he was not taken seriously in Moscow, but then when they understood his positions, in particular when they looked at the alternative Hillary Clinton, a lot of people, most people in the Russian establishment, sympathized with Trump. They would certainly tell you that no, they were not supporting Trump, they didn't do anything for him, but they still would argue that Trump was a better choice. Well, and they were very bitterly disappointed when they looked at what actually happened with U.S. foreign policy during the Trump administration. And of course, you know better than me that a lot of people in senior positions, even in the White House, were occupied by people who fundamentally did not agree with Trump or even despised him personally. Do you think it is possible that if there was a new Trump administration or any other Republican administration, that there would be a serious substantive change in the American foreign policy?
If I am right, and the economic disaster that confronts us over the next 2 years is as severe as I think it will be, Dmitry, yes, we will see a profound change of course. You cannot sort of careen like a car out of control down the side of a mountain if you run out of gas, your brakes fail, and you can't avoid the trees and rocks there to stop you. So I think that's where we are right at the moment. We have careened out of control. We have set forces in motion we don't understand and can't control. And there's another feature to this, and that is, and you know this better than I do, most Americans today are worried about the damage done by the hurricane. Most Americans are not thinking about Ukraine, and I doubt that large numbers of them can even find it on the map. The bottom line is that as the domestic unrest grows as a result of the financial and economic downturn and crisis that I think is looming on the horizon, it will be very difficult for anybody to do anything overseas except withdraw forces, consolidate their position, and hope for the best here at home.
But am I right? I take your point that if you are not in power, in particular if your party really doesn't control not only the executive branch, but even a single house in the American Congress, then obviously what you think is not very relevant. But there is a perception in many places that it's not just a question of who is in power, but that the whole American foreign policy elite basically supports the current globalist approach. Am I correct in my impression that there are a lot of people in this elite who actually have rather different views, and given an opportunity, they would be prepared to articulate and to conduct a rather different foreign policy?
You know, again, you're better positioned to make that evaluation than I am. I just don't know enough about the people that may be out there, because let's be frank, most people are running silent. or they are effectively prostituting themselves to the status quo. For the last 30 years, if you wanted to make a great deal of money and be successful in Washington, you aligned yourself with people like Madeleine Albright, Sandy Berger, and so forth. Those people and their descendants or their clones are in power now. And I think that's why you see retired generals, one after the other, show up and declare their loyalty and confidence that Russia will be defeated and so forth. I'm simply saying I see a sea change coming. And whenever you get a sea change, there are lots of windsocks in this city. They will change direction too when they see that the direction of the political winds have changed and the economic winds. But more important, I think you will see new personalities emerge. The sad truth is that our system has never been a very good one for foreign and defense policy. We tend to lobotomize the government every 4 to 8 years, as my friend Chaz Freeman likes to point out. But this time, I think you will see a true lobotomy. I think a lot of these people will be swept away in the disaster that lies ahead. And that disaster is not war, it's economic disaster.
Well, this was not a very optimistic conversation, but I am very appreciative of your sober and penetrating analysis. And I do agree with you with something very optimistic, that what we see today is obviously quite discouraging. It's very difficult for me, at least, to look at the current Washington with its foreign policy establishment, which is predictable in a very, in my view, non-analytical way, where ideological cliché prevail over serious evaluation. But having said that, I agree with you on something very fundamental. I don't know exactly when the change is going to come, but for anyone to give up on the American ability to conduct a very different and much more effective foreign policy, everyone who would operate on this assumption, whether it would be friend or foe, they're likely to be quite surprised. Thank you very much and see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.